Tonight we're going to consider then, I've called it God's answer, because it's the answer to the prayer. Hopefully you were here or have heard the first talk, because I'm not going to recap, apart from saying that Daniel, as Russell has already indicated, was praying for the return of his people, for the city of Jerusalem, and importantly the sanctuary, the temple, to be established again, and that they may be praised, that Yahweh may be praised there. So he's in the middle of this prayer, and tonight we're going to see an instant response from God. An amazing prophecy some 600 years before Christ came, that was recorded through the power of God's Spirit for our learning. A prophecy that was written through the power of God before the events came, and it was fulfilled in precise detail, as our brother Russell again mentioned in his prayer. And that confirms my faith, and hopefully tonight it'll confirm your faith. Some details are not easy to understand. 70-week prophecy, that's a challenge when I got that one. So we'll work through it, and we will see how God controls the affairs of man to bring through the angels that great day of our Lord Jesus Christ's return. So God's instant response to Daniel's prayer. So we see that. We started with Brother Sam. He says in verse 20, "And whilst I was speaking and praying and confessing my sin and the sin of my people Israel, and presenting my supplication before the Lord my God for the holy mansion of my God, yea, while I was speaking in prayer, even the man Gabriel." So the first point I want to point out here, while I was speaking at the beginning of thy supplication, Gabriel appears, being caused to fly swiftly. So we know Daniel hasn't finished the prayer. He's interrupted. You know, that's the first point tonight, that he's instantly interrupted, and he's given what he wants to know, to understand. But he's given more than what he prayed for, as we shall see. And it's the same idea of that instant response. If you're making notes, we won't go to it, but Genesis 24, verse 15. There Eliezer was praying, wasn't he? Seeking a wife for Rebekah. And on that occasion, the instant response was there in front of him. It was on that occasion the appearance of a human that he wanted to know about, be a bride for his master. However, this was an unexpected visit of an angel of God, the messenger Gabriel. And he's met Gabriel already. If you just turn back, keep a marker there, chapter 8 and verse 16. We saw it in our considerations of chapter 8. So this is not the first time that he's met this angel. It's actually, from the record, it looks like it's the second occasion. And so he's caused to fly swiftly. We read that in verse 21 there, whom I had seen in the vision at the beginning. So that's reference to what we just looked at, being caused to fly swiftly. My margin says with weariness or flight. Didn't really help me. So the root word means utterly exhausted. So there's a sense of effort that Gabriel is sent in haste. There's energy, there's effort in him coming from the throne of his father down and meeting Daniel, interrupting that prayer with the answer and more. And so we see that his prayer is interrupted. And in verse 21 we see that he touched me about the time of the evening oblation. So I guess maybe he was prostrate, we don't know, but the fact he touched him is as if like to indicate his presence, isn't it? And it was at the time of the evening sacrifice. Not a word is wasted, is it? That's the Mincha offering, one that was the daily offering of dedication that occurred, and we know from Exodus 29:41, at the time of around 3 p.m. It was the timing of the burning of incense. We know incense from Psalm 141 verse 2 is the symbol of prayer. So here he is at the time of the oblation, the time of the sacrifice, of dedication, that he himself is a living sacrifice in a sense, making this prayer to his God. And it's that time that Gabriel is sent by the Father. And the commandment came forth, as it says there. At verse 23, the beginning of thy supplications, the commandment came forth. The word came forth there means to go out. The commandment was to go out, exit. And therefore that's why I say Gabriel was sent from the presence of God. And we see that in the Genesis 28 verse 12, the vision of Jacob by Bethel, by the angels descending and ascending that ladder. And here's that one who's come straight down to Daniel now. God was pleased to make known his purpose to Daniel, to comfort him with how his personal burning desire that his people, the Jews, would return to their land, that they would be able to worship their God again at Jerusalem, which was the apple of his eye, would be realised. And it was also to provide Daniel comfort. Comfort after the emotion and physical reaction we see that he had at the end again of chapter 8, after he'd had that great vision of the period of time that would occur when he fainted and was sick. And he's praying there for the restoration. He knows, as we said from Jeremiah, that this is the time of expectation. This is the dispensation of faith. This is the time that the 70 years are up. The Babylonian power's gone. We're now in the Medo-Persian time. And therefore there's a sense of expectation. And God reveals, yes, this is going to occur, Daniel. But more than that, the Messiah would come, one who would actually deliver ultimate deliverance and ultimate restoration of not just Israel, not just the Jew, but of all people, and replace that system that he'd set up with Moses. So we see that with what's God's purpose in sending Gabriel. We've got the colours again. Some people found that helpful. So we find in verse 22 there how he's sent to him. And he says in verse 22, informed me and talked with me and said, "O Daniel, I am now come forth. I'm come to you." We've seen why that. I've been sent out with this purpose. For what purpose? Well, we see that in a moment. But I just want to note this, first of all, in verse 23, he calls him, "Thou art greatly beloved. I'm come to show thee, for thou art greatly beloved." That's how Daniel was regarded by our God. My margin there says, for against great beloved, a man of desires. We see that it means to take pleasure in, to delight in. It's used again, and I'm not going to expand it because it's the next brother and the next talk on Daniel 10, but you see it in Daniel chapter 10, if you want to make a note, verse 11 and verse 19. So 3 times Daniel is called beloved. It's a high status, one that God found pleasure in. That's what each one of us are trying to seek to do, isn't it? To give him pleasure. And then he says there in verse 22, "I'm come forth to give thee skill and understanding." So let's just take those 2 elements. The 2 purposes why Gabriel was sent to Daniel was caused to leave the Father and go and interrupt his prayer. We see there where he says, "I'm come forth to give thee skill." My margin says to make thee skillful of understanding. The skill has the idea to look upon, to comprehend. And you can see how that's linked to the word consider and know that we've got there as well. It's the similar idea that we see in verse 23 there, that, where he says to consider the matter or consider the vision. And then in verse 25 to know. Know therefore and understand. So that's what he's trying to get him to do, is to perceive, to learn and to understand. And then we have the idea of skill. You can see there, of understanding. Apologies. Verse 22, give thee skill and understanding. You see it in green. It's there in verse 23, obviously, 22, and in verse 25. You can scan your eye down there, where he says, this is what I'm trying to do, Daniel. And what does that mean? Well, it means a comprehension. A comprehension of what? Of when these events in the future are going to occur that you're praying for. Of when that captivity is going to end, when they're going to restore Jerusalem, and when other events are going to come that brings him comfort. That brings him comfort that the things that he's seen, the huge expanse of time, that there's something shorter in that time, relatively, relating to the Messiah. And so God's 70-week structure is the following that I put forward to you there. So, 70 weeks, as we shall see, that prophecy is the length of time. In verse 24 is the bringing in of everlasting righteousness through the Messiah. Verse 25, we have a time frame of when Jerusalem would be restored to the coming of Messiah. In verse 26, we have Messiah to be cut off, and then another destruction of Jerusalem and the temple. He's praying for the restoration, and God says, yes, it's going to occur, and then it will be destroyed again. And then verse 27, Messiah will end the Mosaic covenant, the Jewish age, and the future destroying power is judged by God. There's going to become another destruction. Yes, a restoration, and then another destruction. A destruction of those things that he holds dear to do with the Mosaic covenant, because something far superior was coming. We see this in verse 24, beginning of it. It says, 70 weeks are determined, decreed, the ESV says, decreed upon thy people and upon the holy city. Those are the very last two elements of his prayer when it was interrupted. Look at verse 19, where he says there, O Lord, hear, O Lord, forgive, O Lord, hearken and do, defer not for thine own sake, O my God, for thy city and thy people are called by thy name. The city and the people, and here it is. Know and understand, upon thy people and the city. This is what's going to happen. And God acknowledges that the people and the city that are his are Daniel's. That's the point. And the prophecy being 70 weeks is 70 times 7. 70 weeks. We know a week's 7 days. We know that. Why that number? Well, I think we know that God reveals now in his plan and his purpose, doesn't he? 70. What does that mean to you if you say 70? Well, to me, that's the symbolic number of the Gentiles. From Genesis 10. That's quite obvious. Multiplied with the number of perfection, God's rest, or the Jewish Sabbath. 7. 70, Gentile. 7, Jew. Yeah? To get the time period. Oh, why put it in those terms otherwise? And I think that points forward to the greater restoration and therefore the deliverance, as we say, of the effect of sin on mankind. That it caused Judah to go into captivity. We saw that last week. Their sin, their transgression, their wickedness, all those things are manifested not just by the Jew but by all people, that they're going to be overcome now with the coming of Messiah, who would confirm the covenant with many. And I see that's not just Jews, many, that's Jews and Gentiles. So the purpose of the coming of Messiah, well, it's twofold. There's two reasons that Daniel is told to know, to consider, to understand, and to have skill in. The first one is about stopping this. It's to finish the transgression. It is to make an end of sins. And it's to make a reconciliation for iniquity. That's picking up on what we saw last time. Transgression, sins and iniquity. Those different elements that we thought about and the different expression of that waywardness, that falling short of the glory of God, as Brother Russell put in his prayer. And so it's those things, isn't it? What does that mean? Finish. Notice. Make an end. Make a reconciliation. Is it saying the same thing? No. Finish, if you look in the margin, has the idea of restrain. It's the idea of to shut up, to close it, to shut up, to close the transgression. Israel's rebellious, presumptuous sin. Make an end of sins means, as the margin says, they're to seal up. The idea of when we stumble, when we fail, when we do these things that we shouldn't do, to seal those up. The disobedience to God. And then make a reconciliation. That has the idea to cover over our iniquity. Make an atonement for our iniquity. The perverse, wrong behaviour, the thoughts, the words of human nature. To be hid from our God, who is pure and undefiled. That's what he's being told here, to understand. I'm going to finish. I'm going to make an end. I'm going to make reconciliation, Daniel. And it's also to start. That's going to end, but something's going to begin. Start. I'm going to bring in. I'm going to seal up, and I'm going to anoint these elements. I'm going to bring in everlasting righteousness. Let's read verse 24 where it says there to make reconciliation and to bring in everlasting righteousness and to seal up the vision and prophecy and to anoint the most holy. What does that mean? You bring something in, it enters in, it comes in, doesn't it? It's an access enabled. An access enabled to everlasting righteousness, overcoming the rebellion of mankind, that first one, finishing the transgression. God would act. Isaiah 59 verse 16 we know. And God saw that there was no man and wondered that there was no intercessor. Therefore his arm brought forth salvation, or brought salvation unto him, and his righteousness sustained him. And that was carried out by his Son, wasn't it? By the Messiah. By the Lord Jesus Christ. Hebrews 9:15. For this cause he is the mediator of the new covenant, by the means of death for the redemption of the transgressions under the first covenant. You can see that. The first point, finish the transgressions. Hebrews says that he redeemed those under the first covenant of their transgressions. They which are called might receive the promise of everlasting inheritance, everlasting righteousness. You can see the parallels. Those who died in sin will have a covering for sin in the resurrection by the grace of God to be seen as righteous. To seal up, what does that mean? Well, it has the idea to bind together. So to seal up the vision and prophet. The AV margin there. Not the prophecy, but the prophet. So the prophet, the means, and the message together. What is that would be achieved in the Messiah? And what does Jesus say in the Gospels? Jesus says, believe in me for the work's sake. Test me of the true prophet, whether what I say comes to pass. And in John 6 verse 27, he says, him hath God the Father sealed. He applied it to himself. God has sealed me. Seal up the vision and the prophet. And he says, I am that prophet. God has sealed me. The vision was sure and the prophecy fulfilled and finished and God's righteousness upheld. He'd made an end of the sins. He sealed up the new covenant, didn't he? And finally, anoint the most holy or holiest of all. We know anointing is the consecration of the Holy of Holies. That idea there of the most holy means holiness of holiness. It's so holy, it's so separate, it's so unique. And therefore it wasn't just used of a place, it was actually used of an individual. Let's just keep a marker in Daniel. Let's just find that, just because it's an important point. Let's go back to 1 Chronicles 23, please. Hopefully. Verse 13, and here's the occasion of the consecration of Aaron. So it's about an attribute. It's used in relation to a person. So 1 Chronicles 23 verse 13, the sons of Amram, Aaron and Moses, and Aaron was separated. So this is the idea of holiness, yeah? And he should sanctify the most holy things, he and his sons forever, to burn incense before Yahweh, to minister unto him, and to bless in his name forever. So that idea of sanctified, of that separation, we can see coming through here. This idea of being anointed for that purpose. And we can see how it was that he should carry out God's purpose. Turning back into our reading in Daniel chapter 9, we see that that was the purpose of the Messiah. If we go back to verse 25. We know Messiah there is the word, and in verse 26, Messiah, the only two times the English word is used, and it's linked to the means, to the way to stop sin and death, this everlasting righteousness. And the prophet of God, Jesus Christ, was anointed, wasn't he? You ask the kids, when was he anointed? When does the title Christ apply to Jesus? Well, we know that. It was at his baptism. After that, the title is used. Before that, it is not used, because he was anointed by the power of God. Luke 3 verse 22, and the Holy Spirit descended in a bodily shape like a dove upon him. And a voice came forth which said, Thou art my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. And Jesus led the most holy of all life. Holiness of holiness, wasn't it? It was total separation to God's will. He did totally what his Father wanted. So much so, Hebrews says, for such a priest became us, who is holy, harmless, undefiled, separate from sinners. 4 different adjectives describing his separateness, his holiness. The anointing of the most holy. Here was the one that was holiness. He was set apart to God's will. Of all that has ever lived, and is now consecrated forevermore. Psalm 45 says those well-known words, doesn't it? Verse 6, God anointed him with the oil of gladness above thy fellows. He was marked out as separate in all ways because he did not sin. And so with that purpose of the Messiah coming that we read of in verse 24 there, we see God's answer to Daniel's plea. Remember, he's praying for the restoration of Jerusalem, of that release from captivity. So let's just look at that element now. So it's from the going forth of the commandment, verse 25. Know therefore and understand that from the going forth of the commandment, okay, an edict would occur. And what would that edict do? Well, first of all, is to restore and build Jerusalem. Don't worry about the italics for the moment, but to restore and build Jerusalem. We read it there, don't we? To restore and build Jerusalem unto the Messiah, the Prince. So the first thing is Jerusalem to be restored. The capital city of Judah, the united capital of the united kingdom of Israel, both north and south. As we said, it's the city of apples, or the city or the apple of God's eye. He selected it. He had a very close association with it. We know that. He put his name there. We read last week in Ezra 1, verses 1 to 3. We read how later that year, when David receives the vision, that Cyrus made that proclamation. We'll look at the dates in a moment. To return to Jerusalem, to build the house of Yahweh, God of Israel. That was their purpose. That's about what's going to happen, to restore and build Jerusalem. It's going to occur. What else is he told? His answer. Well, the street shall be built again. It's a little bit of a hidden enigma. The street literally means a broad or open place. And we know from Ezra 10 verse 9, it was a place where Israel could gather together and worship before the temple with the ministers that he brought back. And he sat in the gate of the house of his God. Nehemiah 8 verses 1, 3 and 16, we're told the people gathered into the street. That was before the water gate. And they spoke unto Ezra the scribe to read out the book of the law of Moses, which the Lord commanded to Israel. So it's associated with the worship of God, with the temple, where they gathered in their worship of their God as they read the law on that occasion through Ezra. So that would be restored. It shall be built again. Restore and build Jerusalem. And the wall. Notice that. And the wall. My margin says the breach or the ditch. Nehemiah, 33 times, that word occurs. As he fulfilled this aspect of the restoration, of restoring the wall of Jerusalem. He was concerned for their welfare. We read, as we know in Nehemiah 1 verse 3, the wall of Jerusalem also is broken down, and the gates thereof are burned with fire. And that's why he was sad, and that's why he wanted to go back and help his people. He wanted to fulfill this part of this prophecy. I can't show you it tonight, but there's beautiful parallels between Nehemiah's prayer and that of Daniel's prayer. And I'm sure he's doing that because he knew what Daniel had had in this prophecy. But that's another time. And he was then given leave, wasn't he, to take leave, to go down to there. He surveyed the walls for 3 days. And then in the remaining 49, he built. So 52 days it was completed from when he arrived to when it's finished. Amazing. And we're given this little detail as well. Even in troublous times. Verse 3 there, in strait times. Not straight as in straight, but in pressured, difficult times. Means distress, constraint, pressure. And we know the first decree by Cyrus was later revoked due to the opposition of the building of the city. And the palace led by Rehum the chancellor and Shimshai the scribe that were told in Ezra 4 verse 23 and 24. Later at the time of Nehemiah, probably more well known, the constant pressure of those three, Sanballat, Tobiah and Gershom, that we find, for instance, in Nehemiah 4 verse 7. So he's told, Daniel, it'll occur. What you're praying for, I will achieve. And it will start with the commandment going forth. And Jerusalem will be built again. The street will be built again. The wall will be built again. But it will be in troublous times. And we know that occurred. So we want to look now how that prophecy, where do you start? What's the first commandment of the king? Where do we start for the giving forth of the commandment, the decree? Well, before we do that, I just want to just go back one stage. I'm going to look at how that, and just remind you, I'm sure you know this, is 4 phases of desolation. Okay, this is why it wasn't clear, oh, well, where are we with the 70 years? So you got the 8th year of Nebuchadnezzar, he comes down to Jehoiachin, takes those. Second one, 19th, he comes down, builds the walls, builds the temple. 23rd year, takes another 745. He makes Gedaliah governor, and then they slay him, and the rest of them go, oh dear, we shouldn't have done that, and they all rush down to Egypt and try to take Jeremiah with them. Okay, so there's like 4 desolations, total empty of the land, total destruction, total nobody there. And that's the destruction. And I was blown away when I looked at this, because that's really quite clear, isn't it? The total abandonment of the land. And that matches against 4 phases of restoration of the city and the place of worship. I've never seen this, so if you've seen it, great. But if you haven't, then hopefully excited, because I find it exciting. Here they are. So the first year of Cyrus, Zerubbabel returns with nearly 50,000 captives. Okay, and that he returns to Jerusalem, they rebuild the temple. There's the decree, there's the date, 536 BC. Second year of Darius, they start work again. It's his decree, and he says, yes, that still stands, get going. So you build the temple. Reaffirmation, it's finished 4 years later, is the 518 BC. This one, 7th year of Artaxerxes, Ezra returns with about 2,000, mainly all to do with the worship of God. Please note that. Priests, Levites, singers and Nethinim, temple servants. That's what he had to go back, because they didn't have enough of these. Some of these weren't even present to help to actually officiate in the temple. So he encourages full worship in Jerusalem, and that was about the date, 457 BC. And then 20th year of Artaxerxes, that's when Nehemiah returns, rebuilds the wall, installs the gates, and the city is then secure, and that's in 44 BC. Precision? Yes. A planner? Yes. The mind of God? Yes. There it is. 4 desolations, 4 restorations. Each temple, full worship in the temple, the gate and the city being secure. Fulfillment of what is prophesied here in the Bible. Amazing, isn't it? What's remarkable as well, it was exactly 70 years from the time here to the time here. It wasn't 69, wasn't 71, it was 70 years when that occurred. And there's actually another 70 years across here as well. It's not so easy, I think it goes from there to there. So I just put you the first one across the 2 there, showing that precision. What Daniel prayed for, God said would happen, did happen. And so with that, I want us to consider the other elements that we probably find a little bit more confusing, but we can hopefully walk our way through and understand. As we consider the 70 weeks prophecy, the time periods revealed relating to the Messiah. Before we start that, we just have the point down here. I've appointed thee a day for a year, Ezekiel 4 verse 6. I find that quite helpful. Ezekiel is the time of Daniel. He's confirming a day for a year principle still. And so we got here the verse heading the time period in weeks. You'll have equivalent days, equivalent years, and what that's linked to, okay? So just to help you as we work through that. I mentioned the time because God created the world in 7 days. You know that? 7 days make our week. And we've got the fact there in Ezekiel 4 and also Numbers 14:34 for the day, principle of a day for a year. Still holding good at the time of Daniel, in case you think, well, it doesn't apply then. And I convert the days into solar years, not lunar years. I've looked at all that. The Jewish calendar works by the moon. It gets quite complex. I thought we'd try and keep it simple, just solar years tonight. So here we go, verse 25. This is the number detail, if you like. So in that bit about the restoration, if we go back to verse 25, we find out to restore and to build Jerusalem, one bookend, unto the Messiah the Prince, the other bookend, shall be 7 weeks, one time frame, and 62 weeks, other time frame. Okay? So there's the 7 weeks. 7 weeks, 7 times 7, 49. 49 days. Day for a year, 49 years. All follow me so far? Feels a little bit like school? Yes? No? Numbers? Help? Okay. So 62 weeks, 62 times 7, isn't it? 434. And then 7 and, so if we put that 7 and the 62 together, we get 69. That and that makes that. Yeah? We all following that so far? Laura's giving me a nod. Thanks, Laura. I know you're good. So the decree to restore and build Jerusalem unto the appearance of Messiah, the total length is this. Okay? Right, we all got that? Okay, the next bit then we're told is that after the appearance, verse 26, and after 62 weeks shall Messiah be cut off. Okay, so after that, there's going to be a cutting off. So I've put it like this. And after the 62 weeks, which is this period here. Messiah will be cut off for himself. And that's after that. Well, then verse 27 we're given, and he shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week. So there's another week. So here's the confirm the week, 7 days. Messiah confirms the covenant. However, and in the midst of the week he shall cause the sacrifice and the oblation to cease. Whatever that is, in the middle of that week, middle of the week 1 here, so the middle of that is 3.5, half a week, Messiah causes the sacrifice and oblation to cease. So hopefully, we've walked you through that. You can see the second part is after his appearance. It's an additional time period that relates to the purpose of Messiah. What he's about to do, he's going to be cut off, not for himself. We read there, verse 26, Messiah should be cut off, but not for himself, and confirming the covenant with many. And we see that causes the sacrifice and the oblation to cease. Sacrifice being the slaughter of animals, oblation, this interestingly relates back to the Mincha offering will cease that we saw earlier. So, the great big question is, when does this period of years start? When's the edict? When's the going forth of the commandment to say this is the starting period, one bookend to go all the way through to this bookend? Well, let's have a look. All right, there's a few. We've got first year of Cyrus, we've seen this. You've got to give a year or 1 year either side. The dating isn't exact because there's a lot of, it's not exact. It's as simple as that. So it could be 536, could be 537, could be 535. So I'll just put it like that. So if you go 483 years later, you get to 53 BC. That's not exact because we know it's 3 years out, but I'm just going on that system for the moment. So that could be 49. Second year, we got 518. That's when he did a decree. 35 BC. 7th year, 457, AD 27. 20th year of Artaxerxes, 444, comes here. Okay, so, how does that help me? Well, if we just look at it, the time of Christ appearing according to the traditional calendar, they say he was born at 0. It wasn't. It's probably more like 3 or 4 years beforehand. Yeah, they got it wrong in the dating, okay? So don't go 0, add 30, we're looking for AD 30. There's no AD 30 there. You've got to go, okay, it wasn't AD 0, or it wasn't 0 when Jesus was born, and there wasn't any year 0. It went from BC 1 to 1, yeah? Okay, so we lose a year there, so it's the 3-4 year before. So if you go back 3 or 4 years from 30, you don't get 53 or 35. That's way out. You get to here, AD 27, yeah? And that's not random, that is precise. That is where it is. It fits exactly. You can't have this one, it's just too far forward. And so therefore, with that time frame, you can look at the book, 70 Weeks of Daniel and Persian Chronology, that one there. There's lots out there. I've looked at quite a few, and I've plumped on that one. Our community use and elsewhere as well. And so we can see it's this one here that's the edict, I believe, okay? Artaxerxes Longimus, who in 457, and we shall see that was the one that said yes to Ezra going back. And for me, that's just significant because I think that is a very powerful piece of evidence. We've got the dates that to me indicate it's that, but this second one, it was then that Ezra going back allowed the Mosaic Code, the sacrifices, the worship, the singing, and everything else to occur, because that's when the Nethinims and the Levites and the teachers all went back. Yes, there was some priests before that, but there wasn't the Nethinims and there wasn't the singers, as far as I could see. So therefore, the total worship of God was fully operational with this edict. Time to restore the place, Daniel. And therefore, it was this decree that allowed the temple to be fully functional again. And this is, then a bit later on, this was this one that allowed Nehemiah to go back and build the walls. And interestingly, if you do that time period there, you can look at the dates. They're pretty close to each other. You can see the edicts. It's interesting that according to Pussy, the historian, interesting name, he says, let me just find my notes, that he lived about 45 of that 49-year period, Nehemiah. So Nehemiah and Ezra worked in conjunction around that time. Ezra re-established the full worship of the temple that was restored from the previous 2 edicts, and Nehemiah finished off the walls to finish the actual place of Jerusalem being restored. And so I think that's really strong evidence for that edict, not just the timing, but also the purpose, relating back to the prayer of Daniel. And so if we look at a chart, got it off the internet, so doesn't mean you got everything right, but it seems to summarise it well. Here's our decree of Artaxerxes to restore Jerusalem. You go over and you go 69 weeks, which is the equivalent years that we've done. You turn those to then we come to AD 27. We saw that. Autumn. We know Jesus was not born in the winter. We know the text internally tells us it was the time of a certain time when the shepherds were out, etc. The text there tells us that it was autumn. We know 3.5 years was his ministry, so it's not difficult. And this is where Jesus is baptised and anointed. So let's just highlight this for us. 69 weeks, that date, we go that period of time, we get to AD 27, which relates to that. That's when Jesus was revealed as Messiah to the nation. Yes, Simon saw him in the temple and realised they're waiting for the consolation of Israel, but this is when he revealed himself as the Messiah, when he was anointed and then went preaching. We have this other week, the 69 weeks, and that final week that we've got in verse 27. He shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week. So there's the extra week. Ends around AD 34 if you add the week from 27. And in the midst of that week, we're told he's cut off. In the spring, Jesus dies on the cross or on the stake. So in the middle, 3.5 years exactly from here, he dies. This is precision, my dear brothers and sisters. This is precise, even to the 3.5, 6 months within that year. And then finally we have the end, when he shall make a covenant with many. Yes, he did his sacrifice. Yes, it was there that he died. But that covenant for many, the full impact of that was when they rejected the gospel and the focus shifts to the Gentiles. That occurred, as we know, obviously, with the conversion of the Gentiles, particularly Acts of the Apostles. Saul, who was then called Paul, who cast his clothes down and witnessed Stephen's martyrdom, is around this time here, according to scholars. So it fits with the preaching to the Gentiles. The one there is rejecting that God in his speech, says that God does not dwell in temples made with hands. It was there to the forefathers, to the patriarchs. And then indicates it's not about the place, the temple itself, it's about the worship being correct. And so there's a lot of detail there, I know, but we can see that's hopefully just a diagram to summarise of the precision. And because that's precise, brothers and sisters, I take great confidence that the precision of God's word about those things that are yet to occur will occur as he says. Not a word's wasted. It gives us total confidence that those things will occur as he says. So what about these difficult verses, the elements in 26 and 27 that sort of seem to parallel? How do we understand that? So I thought I'll try and do it in a way that hopefully brings you along with me. So let's have a little look. So we've got here the prince, destroy the city and the sanctuary. So we talked about his great distress. Restoration will come, yet it will be destroyed again. ESV, the prince shall destroy the city and the sanctuary, similar. And then over there here, the ruler who will come will destroy the city and the sanctuary. This is not Jesus, the prince, but the ruler who will come. Okay? Verse 26, we get here, and the end thereof shall be with a flood, and unto the end the wall desolations are determined. End. Its end shall come. A flood covers everything. It covers everything, doesn't it? Yeah? Desolations are decreed. The end will come like a flood, okay? War will continue. So we had war until the end, and desolations are being decreed. It's interesting there, this time of conflict that was indicated here, that would end in the end of desolations occurring. And then verse 27, we have the overspreading of abominations. You shall make it desolate into the consummate, but determined shall be poured upon the desolate. The wing of the abominations will come. And the wing of the temple is set up an abomination that causes desolation. The decree is poured out upon him. So you can see this associated with the sanctuary, with desolation, with defilement of idolatry being associated, as you can see as you work through there. So you can see there become a time when the temple would bring destruction, and then the destroyer, the desolator, would indeed be destroyed. So what's the interpretation of that? Hopefully, You followed that well. Verse 26, the people and the prince, total destruction of Jerusalem and the temple worship. We can see that. And Titus in AD 70 destroyed the desolation of the temple and Jerusalem. I read, and I didn't know this, Titus didn't want to destroy Jerusalem. He actually gave an order to his army to say, don't destroy it. He respected it. Yet it seems that some rogue soldiers decided they'd start a fire, and off it went, and before he knew it, the whole place was up in fire. So it's amazing. He tried to just actually preserve it, but God said it would be destroyed, and therefore it occurred. Here at the end, well, that's the end of the Jewish age in the land. From that desolation, they weren't there for millennia until they came, obviously back in 1948. So they dispersed throughout the Roman Empire. Not saying they weren't before, but they ended as a nation. They were no longer. It was ploughed. It was overturned, wasn't it? And they were scattered throughout the whole Roman Empire. There'd been great hostility, 40 years of the zealots, the Jewish insurrectionists, war and hostility constantly in the land. And so that Jewish age ended. The Mosaic age, the Herod's temple that they revered through the Roman Empire, destroying many. I think there was over 1 million in Jerusalem at the time of the end that were destroyed. And then in verse 27, this overspreading of abominations, and then here, the modified worship by Jews and Gentile. Idols occurred. Roman governor sent up his own thing there. Banners, idols were set up there in the temple that was supposed to be God's temple. And so that caused, and determined shall be poured upon the desolator. There'd be a judgment on the Roman occupier. Roman Empire would be conquered. There'd be a destruction for desolating his sanctuary, desolating the place where he was supposed to be worshipped. But at that time, it probably become a mockery. We know it became a den of iniquity, as Jesus says. So therefore, God would destroy them. And so we can see really there, brothers and sisters, this is the 70-week prophecy. We've gone through it quite quickly. You can look at the slides another time if you need to. And I think this is a good summary slide. Quite a lot of information on here. So here was our commandment to rebuild by the Persian king here. And so here's the rebuilding of Jerusalem, Ezra and Nehemiah. And that's probably why we got that 49-year period there. Why wasn't it just given one big 70 weeks? Why have we got the two bits? And then we got the anointing of Jesus here at Jordan after the 69. We've seen the half there, we've seen here. But the suggestion here of Stephen here and turning to the Gentiles. This is AD 70 there. Crucifixion obviously there. And we can see a summary. So hopefully that's helped us all. And therefore we can continue to understand the accuracy of Bible prophecy. We can look to the future, its certainty, and by God's grace will be part of New Jerusalem. So this should be our vision. Yes, Daniel's vision's amazing. Yes, they give us clarity. Yes, they give us confidence. But this is what it's about, isn't it? Looking forward now from our time. Come hither, I will show thee the bride and the Lamb's wife. And he carried me away in the Spirit to a great and high mountain and showed me that great city. Notice, great city. The holy Jerusalem. It's there again, isn't it? That's the whole theme we've seen. Descending out of heaven from God, having the glory of God. And the Spirit and the bride say, come. And let him that heareth say, come. And let him that is athirst come. And whosoever will, let him take the water of life freely.